May 23rd, 1937, New York City. John D. Rockefeller, the richest man who ever lived, died peacefully in his sleep at his estate in Ormond Beach, Florida. He was 97 years old. When news of his death reached Wall Street, the stock market barely flickered. Rockefeller had retired from active business decades earlier. His empire had been broken up by the government. His power had been distributed among his heirs. But the wealth remained. And it was staggering. At the time of his death, John D. Rockefeller's fortune was estimated at $1.4 billion. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, that's over $400 billion, making him likely the wealthiest person in modern history. He had started with nothing. The son of a con artist and a deeply religious mother growing up in poverty in rural New York. By age 38, he controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. He had created a monopoly so powerful that the federal government had to invent new laws to break it apart. He had been called a genius and a villain, a visionary businessman and a ruthless robber baron, a philanthropist who gave away $500 million and a monster who crushed competitors without mercy. His name became synonymous with wealth itself. To be rich as Rockefeller meant to possess unimaginable fortune. But John D. Rockefeller's legacy is far more complex than just money. He revolutionized the oil industry and created the template for the modern corporation. He pioneered vertical integration and aggressive business tactics that are still studied today. He also created a dynasty. The Rockefeller family would dominate American business, politics, and philanthropy for over a century. Governors, senators, vice presidents, and billionaires all descended from a man who started life in a two-room house with a dirt floor. This is the story of the Rockefeller Empire, from poverty to unimaginable wealth, from kerosene lamps to global oil dominance, from ruthless monopoly to broken dynasty, from one man's vision of total control to a family that would shape America for generations. This is the Rockefeller Empire, oil, power, and the American dream. To understand John D. Rockefeller, you must first understand where he came from. John Davison. Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839 in Richford, New York, a small farming community in the southern tier of the state. His father was William Avery Rockefeller, Bill Rockefeller to his friends. And Bill Rockefeller was a con man. Bill called himself a doctor, though he had no medical training. He travelled from town to town selling patent medicines, bottled elixirs that he claimed could cure cancer, blindness, deafness, and every other ailment. They were worthless. Snake oil. But Bill was charming and persuasive, and he made money. He was also a bigamist. While married to John's mother, Eliza, he maintained a second family under an assumed name in another town. Eliza may not have known about this for years. Bill was frequently absent from home, sometimes disappearing for months at a time on his business trips. When he was home, he was often drunk. But Bill taught young John one crucial lesson. He would later say, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp." Bill would make deals with young John, then change the terms or refuse to pay. He wanted his sons to learn that the world was ruthless and that trust could be exploited. It was a terrible way to raise children, but it taught John D. Rockefeller a lesson he would never forget. Be smarter than everyone else, trust no one completely, and always get everything in writing. John's mother, Eliza, was the opposite of Bill in every way. She was deeply religious, a devout Baptist who attended church constantly and raised her children with strict moral discipline. She taught John thrift, discipline, hard work, and religious devotion. The family had very little money. Bill spent most of what he made and gave Eliza almost nothing. So Eliza pinched every penny. She grew vegetables. She sewed clothes. She made do with almost nothing. And she taught John that wasting money was sinful. John absorbed both lessons. From his father, be ruthless in business, trust no one, always win. From his mother, work hard, save everything, never waste, and justify your actions through religion. This combination, ruthless business tactics combined with religious justification, would define John D. Rockefeller for his entire life. The Rockefeller family moved several times during John's childhood, eventually settling in Cleveland, Ohio when John was 14. Cleveland in the 1850s was a growing city on the shores of Lake Erie. It was becoming a transportation hub. Canals and railroads connected it to the East Coast and to the expanding American West. John attended high school in Cleveland. He was a good student, quiet and serious. He didn't play sports or socialize much. He studied accounting and business. At age 16, John decided not to attend college. College cost money his family didn't have. Instead, he attended a 3-month business school where he learned bookkeeping, penmanship, and commercial law. Then, in 1855, at age 16, John D. Rockefeller went looking for work. For 6 weeks, he walked the streets of Cleveland, going from business to business, asking for a job as a bookkeeper or clerk. Day after day, he was rejected. Finally, on September 26, 1855, a commission merchant firm called Hewitt & Tuttle hired him as an assistant bookkeeper. His starting salary was 50 cents per day. John D. Rockefeller would celebrate September 26 for the rest of his life. He called it Job Day and considered it more important than his birthday. It was the day his business career began. John was an exceptional bookkeeper. He was meticulous, accurate, and obsessive about detail. He kept track of every penny. He questioned every expense. He found errors that others missed. Within 3 years, he was essentially running Hewitt & Tuttle's finances. But when he asked for a raise to $800 per year, he was worth far more. The owners refused. So in 1859, at age 19, John D. Rockefeller quit and went into business for himself. He found a partner, Maurice Clark, an older man with some capital. Together they formed Clark and Rockefeller, a commission merchant business buying and selling grain, meat, and other commodities. Rockefeller borrowed $1,000 from his father at 10% interest because Bill Rockefeller never gave his children anything for free and invested it in the business. Clark and Rockefeller prospered. They were honest, efficient, and careful with money. By 1860, they were making significant profits. Then came the Civil War. When the Civil War began in April 1861, it could have destroyed many businesses. But Clark and Rockefeller thrived. The Union Army needed food, grain, and supplies. Clark and Rockefeller had contracts to supply them. War was good for business. Rockefeller was 22 years old when the war started. He was eligible for the draft. But when conscription began in 1863, Rockefeller paid $300 for a substitute, a legal way to avoid military service by hiring someone else to serve in your place. Rockefeller never apologized for this. He believed he served the Union better by supplying food and making money than by carrying a rifle. While other young men were dying at Gettysburg and Antietam, John D. Rockefeller was in Cleveland, making deals and accumulating capital. By 1863, Clark and Rockefeller was making hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. Rockefeller was becoming wealthy, but he was restless. Commission merchants made steady money, but they didn't make fortunes. Rockefeller was looking for a bigger opportunity. And then in 1863, that opportunity appeared. Oil. Oil had been discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859. A man named Edwin Drake had drilled the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, striking oil at 69 feet. Before this, oil had been a curiosity. Small amounts seeped naturally from the ground and were collected and sold as medicine. But there was no large-scale production. Drake's discovery changed everything. Suddenly, oil could be extracted in large quantities. But what could you do with it? The main use was for illumination. Refined into kerosene, oil could fuel lamps, providing light far cheaper than whale oil or candles. An entire industry sprang up almost overnight. Thousands of men flooded into western Pennsylvania to drill for oil. Fortunes were made and lost in days. It was chaotic, wild, and risky. Oil prices fluctuated wildly. Wells would strike oil one day and run, dry the next. Drillers often went bankrupt. But John D. Rockefeller saw opportunity. Not in drilling, that was too risky, but in refining. Someone had to turn crude oil into usable products like kerosene. Refining was the key bottleneck in the industry. And refineries required capital, organization, and efficiency. Exactly Rockefeller's strengths. In 1863, Rockefeller and Maurice Clark, along with a chemist named Samuel Andrews, invested in a small oil refinery in Cleveland. It was a side business at first. Clark and Rockefeller continued their commission merchant operations, but Rockefeller became increasingly interested in oil. He studied the refining process obsessively. He learned about distillation, about removing impurities, about maximizing yield. He visited other refineries and took notes. Within 2 years, the refinery was more profitable than the commission merchant business. In 1865, Rockefeller made a crucial decision. He wanted to focus entirely on oil. Maurice Clark wanted to stick with commission merchants. The partnership couldn't continue with such fundamental disagreement, so they decided to auction the business. Whoever bid higher would buy out the other partner. The auction took place privately between the two men, bidding back and forth. The price climbed higher and higher, $500, then $1,000, then $5,000. Finally, Maurice Clark bid $70,000. John D. Rockefeller, just 25 years old, bid $72,500. Every penny he could borrow. Clark dropped out. Rockefeller had won. He now owned the entire refinery. Years later, Rockefeller said it was the most important day of his business life. He had bet everything on oil, and he would win beyond anyone's imagination. In 1865, John D. Rockefeller's oil refinery was one of dozens in Cleveland. It was larger than most, but nothing special. But Rockefeller had a vision. He believed the oil industry was too chaotic, too disorganized. Prices fluctuated wildly. Competition was cutthroat. Most refineries operated inefficiently and unprofitably. Rockefeller believed the solution was consolidation. One large, efficient company could dominate the industry, stabilize prices, and maximize profits. In other words, Rockefeller wanted to create a monopoly. He began systematically. First, he made his own refinery the most efficient in Cleveland. He studied every aspect of the refining process and looked for ways to reduce costs. He hired the best chemists to improve refining techniques, increasing the percentage of usable kerosene from each barrel of crude oil. He bought his own timber to make barrels rather than purchasing them from suppliers. He bought his own wagons and horses to transport oil rather than hiring teamsters. He negotiated secret deals with railroads to get lower shipping rates in exchange for guaranteed large volumes. Within a few years, Rockefeller's refinery could produce kerosene cheaper than any competitor. This gave him enormous advantage. In 1870, Rockefeller transformed his business into a corporation, Standard Oil Company of Ohio. The name was carefully chosen. Standard implied reliability and consistent quality, something the chaotic oil industry desperately lacked. Rockefeller owned the largest share of Standard Oil, but he brought in partners: his brother William Rockefeller, Samuel Andrews the chemist, Henry Flagler, and Stephen Harkness, who provided crucial capital. Together they controlled about 10% of America's oil refining capacity. It was a good start, but Rockefeller wanted it all. Between 1870 and 1880, John D. Rockefeller executed one of the most aggressive business campaigns in American history. His strategy was simple: convince every other oil refinery to sell to Standard Oil, or destroy them. Rockefeller preferred to buy out competitors. He would approach refinery owners with an offer: sell to Standard Oil at a fair price, receive Standard Oil stock, and often keep your job managing the refinery. Many accepted. The oil business was brutal and uncertain. The chance to sell out, get guaranteed income, and not have to worry about competition or price fluctuations was appealing. But not everyone sold willingly. Some refinery owners refused. They valued their independence. They didn't trust Rockefeller. For these holdouts, Rockefeller used harsher tactics. He would use his secret railroad deals to undercut their prices. Standard Oil paid lower shipping rates so Standard Oil could sell kerosene cheaper and still make profit. Competitors couldn't match Standard Oil's prices. They lost customers, they lost money. Eventually, they went bankrupt or were forced to sell at a fraction of their refinery's value. Rockefeller was ruthless but patient. He would wage price wars for months or years if necessary, losing money in the short term to drive competitors out of business in the long term. One by one, Cleveland's refineries fell to Standard Oil. By 1872, Rockefeller controlled almost all of Cleveland's refining capacity. Then he moved on to other cities: Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore. The pattern repeated: offer to buy, and if they refused, destroy them through price wars and railroad deals. Some competitors formed alliances to fight back. But Rockefeller always won. Standard Oil was larger, more efficient, and had more capital. It could outlast any competitor. By 1878, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of America's oil refining capacity. John D. Rockefeller, not yet 40 years old, had created the most powerful monopoly in American history. Rockefeller's secret weapon was the railroad. In the 1870s, railroads were the only way to transport oil efficiently from Pennsylvania's oil fields to refineries in Cleveland, New York, and elsewhere. The three major railroads, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Erie Railroad, and the New York Central, competed fiercely for oil shipping business. Rockefeller exploited this competition brilliantly. He approached the railroads with a deal. Standard Oil would guarantee enormous shipping volumes, far more than any competitor could offer. In exchange, the railroads gave Standard Oil massive discounts on shipping rates. But Rockefeller went further. He negotiated secret rebates. The railroads would not only give Standard Oil lower rates, they would also pay Standard Oil a portion of the fees they charged to Rockefeller's competitors. This meant that when a competing refinery shipped oil, they unknowingly paid money to Standard Oil through the railroad rebate system. It was brilliant and completely unfair. Competitors were literally financing their own destruction. When other refinery owners discovered these secret deals, they were outraged. They called it conspiracy and extortion. But it was technically legal. There were no laws against railroad rebates. Rockefeller was simply negotiating better deals than his competitors. In 1872, several railroad executives in large refineries, including Standard Oil, formed a secret organization called the South Improvement Company. The plan was to divide the oil industry among a few large players and use the railroads to control prices and eliminate competition. When news of the South Improvement Company leaked to the press, there was public outrage. Oil producers in Pennsylvania rioted. The Pennsylvania state legislature revoked the company's charter. Rockefeller officially had nothing to do with the South Improvement Company's creation, though he was one of its major beneficiaries. The scandal made Rockefeller's tactics public. Newspapers began calling him a robber baron. Cartoonists depicted Standard Oil as an octopus with tentacles strangling the oil industry. But Rockefeller didn't care about his public image. He cared about winning. And the controversy didn't slow him down. If anything, it accelerated his campaign of consolidation. By 1880, Standard Oil was so dominant that it effectively set the price of oil in America. Rockefeller could decide what kerosene cost, what crude oil was worth, and who would succeed or fail in the industry. He had become the most powerful industrialist in America. But Rockefeller's monopoly created a problem. It was spreading across multiple states, which created legal complications. Each state had its own laws governing corporations. Standard Oil of Ohio couldn't easily control refineries in Pennsylvania or New York. So in 1882, Rockefeller's lawyers invented a new legal structure, the trust. They created the Standard Oil Trust. Shareholders of the various Standard Oil companies in different states exchanged their stock for trust certificates. The trust owned and controlled all the companies. This legal innovation allowed Rockefeller to control a massive interstate corporation while technically complying with state laws. The Standard Oil Trust was revolutionary. It became the template for other massive corporations: the Sugar Trust, the Whiskey Trust, the Steel Trust. The age of the trust had begun, and with it, the age of enormous corporate power that dwarfed anything America had seen before. By 1885, Standard Oil controlled 90% of oil refining, 70% of oil pipelines, and 30% of oil production. It was the largest corporation in the world, and John D. Rockefeller was the richest man in America. So what kind of man was John D. Rockefeller at the height of his power? He was an enigma, ruthless in business but deeply religious in private life. He attended Baptist church every Sunday without fail. He taught Sunday school for decades. He read the Bible daily and prayed often. He genuinely believed his success was divinely ordained. He saw himself as a steward of God's wealth, responsible for using his money wisely and for the benefit of humanity. He lived modestly especially compared to other millionaires of the era. His family lived in a large but not ostentatious house in Cleveland. He didn't drink alcohol, didn't gamble, and didn't attend fancy parties. His only indulgence was golf, which he took up in middle age and played obsessively. He was methodical and unemotional in business. Associates described him as cold, calculating, and impossible to read. He rarely showed anger or excitement. He made decisions based on logic and numbers, not emotion. He was famously frugal. Stories circulated of Rockefeller demanding accounts to the penny, refusing to pay for minor expenses, and obsessively tracking every dollar. One possibly apocryphal story claimed that Rockefeller walked through his refineries counting the drops of solder used to seal kerosene cans. He calculated that reducing the solder by a single drop per can would save thousands of dollars per year. He ordered the change immediately. Whether that specific story is true or not, it captured Rockefeller's character perfectly. Obsessive attention to detail, constant focus on efficiency, and the belief that small savings multiplied by millions of units equaled enormous profit. He was also paranoid about security. He rarely gave interviews. He didn't make public speeches. He avoided having his photograph taken. He trusted almost no one outside his small circle of family and business partners. He communicated through carefully written memos and kept meticulous records of every meeting and decision. And he was extraordinarily patient. While other industrialists were flamboyant risk-takers, Rockefeller was methodical and cautious. He would wait months or years to complete an acquisition if it meant getting better terms. This patience, combined with Standard Oil's enormous resources, made him virtually unbeatable. By the 1890s, John D. Rockefeller was the most hated man in America. Journalists called him a monster. Cartoonists depicted Standard Oil as an evil octopus strangling American industry. Reform politicians railed against the trusts and the robber barons. Rockefeller became the symbol of everything wrong with American capitalism: monopoly, corruption, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a ruthless few. The criticism genuinely hurt Rockefeller. He believed he had improved the oil industry, made kerosene cheaper and more accessible, and created thousands of jobs. He saw himself as a force for order in a chaotic industry. He believed consolidation was economically inevitable and socially beneficial. But the American public saw something different. They saw a man who had crushed competitors, manipulated railroads, and created a monopoly that controlled a vital commodity. State governments began investigating Standard Oil. Journalists like Ida Tarbell wrote exposés detailing Standard Oil's ruthless tactics. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal law designed to break up monopolies and prevent anti-competitive business practices. Standard Oil fought back in courts for years, but the pressure was mounting. In 1906, the federal government sued Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act, demanding the trust be dissolved. The case dragged through courts for 5 years. Finally, on May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil. The court ordered the Standard Oil Trust be broken up into 34 separate companies. It was the most dramatic antitrust action in American history. The world's largest corporation was being forcibly dismantled. Rockefeller, now 71 years old, and in retirement, responded to the news calmly. He understood the political reality. The monopoly era was over, but he had one surprise left. When Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, John D. Rockefeller owned about a quarter of the company's stock. That stock was now divided among 34 separate companies. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California, and dozens of others. Financial experts predicted the breakup would destroy shareholder value. Without the efficiencies of the combined monopoly, the individual companies would struggle. They were spectacularly wrong. The individual Standard Oil companies thrived. They competed with each other, innovated, expanded into new markets, and they all increased in value. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. The breakup created not one monopoly, but multiple enormous oil companies, companies that would dominate the global oil industry for the next century. And Rockefeller owned stock in all of them. Within a few years of the breakup, Rockefeller's fortune had nearly tripled. By 1913, he was worth roughly $900 million, equivalent to over $400 billion in today's money. The government had broken up his monopoly, and it had made him even richer. It was the ultimate irony. And Rockefeller appreciated the irony, even as he remained silent about it publicly. But by the 1910s, Rockefeller had already largely retired from active business. He had stepped back from Standard Oil's day-to-day operations in the 1890s, handing control to professional managers. In 1908, he retired completely, leaving the business world behind. Why? Because John D. Rockefeller had a new project, giving away his fortune. Rockefeller had been donating money to charity since his first paycheck as a teenage bookkeeper. Even when he earned just 50 cents a day, he gave 10% to his Baptist church. As his wealth grew, so did his philanthropy. By the 1880s, he was giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. By the 1890s, millions. But in his retirement, philanthropy became Rockefeller's full-time occupation. He hired Frederick Taylor Gates, a former Baptist minister, to manage his charitable giving. Together they revolutionized philanthropy. Rather than simply donating to whatever causes requested money, Rockefeller and Gates approached philanthropy like a business. They identified important problems, developed strategies to solve them, and invested money systematically and measurably. In 1890, Rockefeller founded the University of Chicago with an initial donation of $600,000. He would eventually give over $80 million to the university, making it one of the world's great research institutions. In 1901, he founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which pioneered research into infectious diseases and would later become Rockefeller University. In 1913, he created the Rockefeller Foundation with an initial endowment of $100 million, at the time, the largest philanthropic organization ever created. The foundation's mission was ambitious: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Rockefeller Foundation money funded medical research, built hospitals and schools, fought diseases like yellow fever and hookworm, and supported agricultural development in dozens of countries. By the time of Rockefeller's death in 1937, he had given away over $500 million, more than half his fortune. Rockefeller's approach to philanthropy, strategic, organized, focused on solving root causes rather than treating symptoms, became the template for modern large-scale philanthropy. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and other modern mega-philanthropists all follow the model Rockefeller pioneered, but Rockefeller's legacy is complicated. Was he a hero or a villain? He created the modern oil industry and made kerosene so cheap that ordinary Americans could afford to light their homes. Before Rockefeller, only the wealthy could afford good lighting. After Rockefeller, even poor families had kerosene lamps. He brought order and efficiency to a chaotic industry. Before Standard Oil, the oil business was wildly unstable. Boom and bust cycles destroyed businesses regularly. Standard Oil provided stability. He created thousands of jobs and made Cleveland a major industrial city. But he also crushed competitors ruthlessly. Small business owners who refused to sell were driven into bankruptcy. Workers who tried to unionize were fired or blacklisted. He manipulated railroads, bribed politicians, and used every legal and quasi-legal tactic to maintain his monopoly. He concentrated enormous wealth and power in his own hands, creating inequality on a scale America had never seen. The oil wealth he controlled helped fuel America's industrial rise, but it also created environmental damage, labor exploitation, and corporate power that continues to shape the world today. Perhaps the best way to understand Rockefeller is to see him as a man of his time, the Gilded Age, when capitalism was largely unregulated and the accumulation of wealth was seen as the highest achievement. Rockefeller played by the rules of his era. The problem was that the rules allowed for monopoly, exploitation, and extreme inequality. The public backlash against Rockefeller and other robber barons eventually led to reforms, antitrust laws, labor regulations, progressive taxation, and the modern regulatory state. In a sense, Rockefeller's excesses helped create the system designed to prevent people like him from accumulating such power again. John D. Rockefeller lived to age 97, extraordinarily long for his era. He spent his final decades at his estates in Florida and New York, playing golf, reading the Bible, and watching his philanthropies grow. He outlived most of his business partners and competitors. He outlived his wife, Laura, who died in 1915. He watched the world change dramatically. He lived through the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, World War I, the Roaring Twenties, and the beginning of the Great Depression. He saw automobiles replace horses, automobiles that ran on gasoline refined from oil, making his fortune even more valuable. He saw the rise of electricity, which threatened kerosene lamps but created new uses for oil. He saw Standard Oil broken up, and then saw the pieces become even more valuable than the original. In his final years, Rockefeller was no longer hated. Time had softened his image. His enormous philanthropic giving had rehabilitated his reputation somewhat. When he died in 1937, newspapers that had once vilified him now praised his business genius and charitable works. He was buried in Cleveland, in Lakeview Cemetery, in a relatively modest grave, considering his wealth. But his death was not the end of the Rockefeller story. It was merely the end of the first chapter, because John D. Rockefeller had built something that would last far beyond his lifetime, a dynasty. John D. Rockefeller had 5 children, with his wife Laura, 4 daughters and 1 son. The daughters, Bessie, Alta, Edith and Pearl, married well and lived privileged lives, but largely stayed out of business and public life. But the son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., would carry on the family legacy. Jr., as he was known, was born in 1874. He grew up in enormous wealth but was raised with his father's values of thrift, hard work, and a religious devotion. Jr. graduated from Brown University and joined Standard Oil's management, but he lacked his father's ruthless business instincts. He was more interested in philanthropy and social causes. When Rockefeller Sr. retired, Jr. took over management of the family fortune and the philanthropic foundations. Jr. devoted his life to giving away the Rockefeller wealth. He funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, donated the land for the United Nations headquarters in New York, and supported countless medical and educational institutions. He also had 6 children, including 5 sons who would become known as the Brothers and would dominate American public life for decades. John D. Rockefeller III devoted himself to philanthropy and cultural institutions. Nelson Rockefeller became governor of New York and vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford. Winthrop Rockefeller became governor of Arkansas. Lawrence Rockefeller became a pioneering venture capitalist and conservationist. David Rockefeller became chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank and one of the most influential financiers of the 20th century. And the youngest, who died in mysterious circumstances in New Guinea, became the subject of one of the 20th century's great unsolved mysteries. The Rockefeller family's influence extended into every area of American life: business, finance, politics, culture, medicine, education, and philanthropy. They built Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, one of the most famous building complexes in the world. They funded the Museum of Modern Art. They supported medical research that led to vaccines and treatments for diseases affecting millions, but they also faced scandals, tragedies, and the gradual dissolution that affects all great fortunes over time. The Rockefeller fortune, massive as it was, had to be divided among more and more descendants with each generation. John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s 5 children inherited his wealth. Those children had children, more than 20 grandchildren total. Those grandchildren had children. By the 4th and 5th generation, there were over 100 Rockefeller descendants, each inheriting a fraction of the original fortune. Today, the Rockefeller family is still wealthy by any normal standard. Family members still control significant trusts and foundations. The family name still carries prestige. But no single Rockefeller today possesses anything close to John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s wealth or power. The fortune has been diluted, split among dozens of heirs, spent on philanthropy, diminished by taxes and inflation. Some descendants have increased their inherited wealth through successful careers. Others have squandered it. Most have simply lived comfortable, privileged lives. The Rockefeller dynasty, like all dynasties, has faded with time, but the institutions the Rockefellers built endure. The universities, hospitals, museums, and foundations they funded continue to operate and benefit millions of people. And the companies that came from Standard Oil, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron remain among the largest corporations on earth. In that sense, John D. Rockefeller's empire never truly ended. It just transformed. Today, if you want to see the legacy of John D. Rockefeller, you can visit dozens of places. You can walk through Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, a complex of 19 buildings that is one of the most famous addresses in the world. Built during the Great Depression by John D. Rockefeller Jr., it represented optimism and American capitalism during the darkest economic crisis in history. You can visit the University of Chicago, one of the world's great research universities, which would not exist without Rockefeller money. You can see Rockefeller University in New York, where scientists have made groundbreaking discoveries in medicine and biology. You can visit Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, an entire restored 18th century city funded by Rockefeller philanthropy. You can fill your car with gasoline from Exxon or Chevron, companies that trace their lineage directly to Standard Oil. You can benefit from medical research funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, research that helped eradicate yellow fever, develop vaccines, and advance public health worldwide. The Rockefeller name is everywhere, woven into the fabric of American institutions. But if you want to understand John D. Rockefeller, the man, you should visit his grave in Cleveland. It's a relatively simple monument, especially for the richest man who ever lived. A tall obelisk marking the family plot. No enormous mausoleum, no ostentatious display of wealth. It's fitting. Rockefeller believed in simplicity and efficiency, even in death. Nearby is the grave of his wife Laura, who he was devoted to for over 50 years despite living a life completely consumed by business. In death, as in life, Rockefeller presents a paradox. Enormous wealth matched with personal modesty. Ruthless business tactics matched with genuine religious devotion. A man who crushed competitors without mercy but gave away $500 million to help humanity. So how should we remember John D. Rockefeller? He was not a hero. His business tactics were often ruthless and sometimes illegal by today's standards. He built his monopoly through intimidation, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of competitors. He concentrated wealth and power to a degree that was dangerous for democracy. His Standard Oil Trust became the template for monopolistic corporations that would dominate industries and exploit workers. But he was also not simply a villain. He brought genuine improvements to the oil industry. He made kerosene cheaper and more accessible to ordinary Americans. He pioneered business practices that made corporations more efficient, and his philanthropy was transformative. The Rockefeller Foundation, the University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, and countless other institutions funded by his wealth have saved millions of lives and advanced human knowledge immeasurably. Rockefeller pioneered the concept of strategic philanthropy, using wealth not just to give handouts but to solve systemic problems. That approach has been copied by virtually every major philanthropist since. Perhaps the best way to understand Rockefeller is to see him as the embodiment of American capitalism in the Gilded Age, both its tremendous productive power and its moral compromises. He showed what was possible when one brilliant, disciplined, ruthless individual focused entirely on accumulating wealth and power. He built an empire larger than most countries, but he also showed why unregulated capitalism was dangerous. His monopoly stifled competition, concentrated power, and created inequality that threatened social stability. The reforms that followed, antitrust laws, progressive taxation, labor protections, financial regulations, were direct responses to people like Rockefeller. In that sense, Rockefeller's legacy is complicated. He helped build modern America, both through his business innovations and through the backlash against his excesses. The oil industry that Rockefeller created continues to shape the world today. When Rockefeller entered the oil business in 1863, oil was used primarily for kerosene lamps. It was a relatively small industry. By the time of his death in 1937, oil had become the most important commodity in the world. It powered automobiles, ships, and aircraft. It fueled factories and heated homes. It was the foundation of modern industrial civilization. Rockefeller didn't foresee all of this. He couldn't have imagined a world with hundreds of millions of cars, jet aircraft, or petrochemical industries. But he built the corporate structures and business practices that allowed the oil industry to grow into the colossus it became. The major oil companies today, Exxon, Chevron, BP, Shell, all operate using business models pioneered by Standard Oil. Vertical integration, global supply chains, massive capital investments, and close relationships with governments, all Standard Oil innovations. And the geopolitical importance of oil, wars fought over oil resources, nations rising or falling based on oil wealth, climate change driven by fossil fuel consumption, all trace back to the industry Rockefeller built. He couldn't have foreseen the consequences, but he set forces in motion that continue to shape the 21st century. The Rockefeller story is ultimately a story about American capitalism itself. In the 1860s, when Rockefeller started in business, America was a growing but relatively poor country recovering from civil war. Capital was scarce. Industry was small scale. Most people were farmers. By the 1930s, when Rockefeller died, America was the richest, most powerful nation on earth. Its corporations were the largest in the world. Its industrial capacity dwarfed all other nations. John D. Rockefeller was both a product of that transformation and one of its primary architects. He showed that in America, anyone, even the son of a con man growing up in poverty, could become unimaginably wealthy through intelligence, discipline, and ruthlessness. That was the promise of the American dream. And Rockefeller fulfilled that promise more completely than almost anyone in history. But his story also revealed the dark side of that dream. The accumulation of extreme wealth required the exploitation of others. It required crushing competitors, manipulating systems, and concentrating power in the hands of a few. The American dream promised opportunity for all. But Rockefeller's success came at the expense of the thousands of competitors he drove out of business, the workers he underpaid, and the democratic institutions he subverted through his economic power. This tension between opportunity and exploitation, between wealth creation and inequality, between individual achievement and social responsibility, defines American capitalism to this day. And John D. Rockefeller embodied that tension perfectly. There are some fascinating lesser-known facts about Rockefeller that reveal his character. Despite his enormous wealth, he never owned a yacht, unlike most millionaires of his era. He thought yachts were wasteful. He habitually carried a pocket full of dimes. He would give them to children he met, along with advice to save money and work hard. He gave out thousands of dimes over his lifetime. He was obsessed with his health and longevity. He hired personal physicians to monitor him constantly. He followed strict diets and exercise regimens. He believed he would live to age 100 through discipline and careful living. He made it to 97. He kept detailed account books his entire life. Even after he became a billionaire, he personally reviewed financial statements and questioned minor expenses. Control and precision never left him. He had a peculiar sense of humor. He loved to play practical jokes on business associates and family members. He would hide objects and watch people search for them. This playful side contrasted sharply with his cold business persona. He genuinely loved his wife Laura and was devastated by her death. For all his ruthlessness in business, he was apparently a devoted, if emotionally distant, husband and father. He never smoked or drank alcohol in his entire life. His only vice was golf, which he played obsessively in his later years. He built golf courses on his estates and played almost daily into his 90s. He had a terrifying ability to stay calm under pressure. Associates reported that during the most intense business crises, when Standard Oil was under attack from competitors or government investigators, Rockefeller remained eerily calm, methodical, and focused. This emotional control was perhaps his greatest business asset. While others panicked or made impulsive decisions, Rockefeller calculated and planned. One of the most controversial aspects of Rockefeller's legacy is the wealth inequality he represents. At his peak, Rockefeller's fortune represented roughly 1.5% of the entire American economy. Imagine one person controlling 1.5% of the entire United States GDP. It's almost incomprehensible. To put that in perspective, if someone had the same percentage of today's US economy, they would be worth over $400 billion, far wealthier than Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, or any modern billionaire. This extreme concentration of wealth in the hands of one individual and a few other robber barons like Carnegie, Morgan, and Vanderbilt created enormous social tensions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Labour movements grew stronger, socialist and communist parties gained support. Reform politicians like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson campaigned against the trusts. The progressive movement, which fought for labour rights, antitrust enforcement, and progressive taxation, was a direct response to the inequality created by people like Rockefeller. The reforms enacted in the early 20th century, antitrust laws, income taxes, labour protections, financial regulations, fundamentally reshaped American capitalism. They didn't eliminate wealth inequality, but they prevented any single individual from accumulating Rockefeller-level dominance again. Today we're seeing a new gilded age. Tech billionaires like Bezos and Musk have accumulated enormous fortunes. Wealth inequality in America is approaching levels not seen since the Rockefeller era. And once again, there are calls for reform, wealth taxes, stronger antitrust enforcement, higher income taxes on the ultra-wealthy. History repeats. The tensions that Rockefeller's wealth created are still with us, just with different faces and different industries. The Rockefeller family tried to manage their public image carefully after the breakup of Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller Sr. hired Ivy Lee, one of America's first public relations professionals, to improve his reputation. Lee orchestrated carefully staged public appearances showing Rockefeller as a kindly old philanthropist, giving dimes to children and supporting worthy causes. It worked, to a degree. By the time of Rockefeller's death, his reputation had softened considerably from the dark days when he was America's most hated man. The family also carefully controlled information. They funded authorized biographies and restricted access to family papers. For decades, the family's version of history was the only version widely available. But in 1904, journalist Ida Tarbell published The History of the Standard Oil Company, a meticulously researched expose of Standard Oil's ruthless business practices. Tarbell's father had been driven out of business by Standard Oil. Her work was motivated partly by personal grievance, but was also serious, groundbreaking investigative journalism. Her 19-part series in McClure's magazine revealed the secret railroad rebates, the intimidation tactics, and the systematic destruction of competitors. Rockefeller never publicly responded to Tarbell's work, but privately he was furious. Standard Oil launched its own publicity campaign to counter her claims. Nevertheless, Tarbell's work influenced public opinion and contributed to the government's antitrust case against Standard Oil. She became one of the most famous journalists in America, and her work established investigative journalism as a force that could challenge even the most powerful corporations. Rockefeller's attempt to control his image had failed. The truth, or at least a version of it, had emerged. An interesting question historians debate: was Rockefeller a genius businessman or simply ruthless and lucky? His defenders point to his genuine innovations. He pioneered vertical integration, controlling every aspect of production from raw materials to distribution. He developed sophisticated cost accounting and efficiency analysis techniques that became standard business practice. He understood that controlling transportation, railroads, and pipelines was the key to controlling the oil industry. He recognized that stability and predictability were more profitable than chaotic competition. These were real insights. Many of Rockefeller's business practices are taught in business schools today as examples of strategic thinking. But his critics argue that his success was primarily due to ruthlessness, not brilliance. He destroyed competitors through predatory pricing, intimidation, and railroad manipulation. He bribed politicians and corrupted democratic institutions to protect his monopoly. He exploited workers and prevented unionization through force. His innovations weren't about creating value, but about consolidating power and eliminating competition. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Rockefeller was genuinely brilliant at organization, efficiency, and strategic thinking, but he was also willing to use tactics that were ethically questionable or illegal. His genius and his ruthlessness were inseparable. You cannot understand his success without acknowledging both. The Rockefeller family has tried to distance itself from the oil industry in recent decades. Several Rockefeller Descendants have become environmental activists, advocating for action on climate change and divestment from fossil fuels. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, one of the family's philanthropic foundations, announced in 2014 that it would divest from fossil fuel investments. This was highly symbolic, the heirs of the man who built the oil industry rejecting that industry over environmental concerns. Some see this as admirable evolution. The family is acknowledging the environmental damage caused by fossil fuels and using their wealth to promote solutions. Others see it as hypocritical. The Rockefeller fortune was built on oil. Divesting from fossil fuels doesn't erase that history or return the wealth accumulated from decades of oil extraction. The family's position is nuanced. They acknowledge their history, but argue that circumstances have changed. Climate change is an existential threat. Continuing to profit from fossil fuels would be morally wrong. It's a fascinating example of how families and institutions grapple with problematic legacies. The Rockefellers can't undo the past, but they can try to use their inherited wealth to address problems their ancestor helped create. Whether this represents genuine evolution or merely guilt-driven public relations depends on your perspective. One of the most enduring mysteries of the Rockefeller family involves Michael Rockefeller, son of Nelson Rockefeller. In 1961, Michael Rockefeller was 23 years old, recently graduated from Harvard, and passionate about anthropology and primitive art. He traveled to New Guinea to collect indigenous art from the Asmat people, a tribe in one of the most remote regions on Earth. On November 19, 1961, Michael and a Dutch anthropologist were traveling by canoe along the New Guinea coast when their boat overturned in rough seas. The Dutch anthropologist stayed with the overturned boat and was rescued. Michael decided to swim for shore, about 12 miles away. He was never seen again. The official story is that Michael drowned or was attacked by sharks or crocodiles, but his body was never found. Rumours persisted for decades that Michael had actually reached shore and was killed and cannibalized by the Asmat people, who were known to practice headhunting and cannibalism. In 2014, journalist Carl Hoffman published a book presenting evidence that Michael had indeed been killed by Asmat tribesmen in revenge for earlier killings by Dutch colonial authorities. The Rockefeller family has never officially accepted this explanation, maintaining that Michael drowned. But the mystery endures. The disappearance of a Rockefeller heir in the jungles of New Guinea has become one of the 20th century's great unsolved mysteries. It's a reminder that even enormous wealth and power cannot protect against fate, chance, and the dangers of the world. The Rockefeller name carries enormous weight even today, over a century after John D. Rockefeller's retirement. Rockefeller is still synonymous with extreme wealth. The phrase "rich as Rockefeller" is still used, though younger generations might be more likely to say "rich as Bezos" now. The family name opens doors. Rockefeller descendants have easier access to elite institutions, business opportunities, and political connections simply because of their name, but the name also carries burdens. Rockefeller descendants grow up with enormous expectations. They're expected to be successful, philanthropic, and socially conscious. Some have thrived under these expectations. Nelson Rockefeller became governor and vice president. David Rockefeller became one of the most influential bankers of the 20th century. Others have struggled with the pressure and the public scrutiny that comes with the name. And some have rejected the family legacy entirely, changing their names or living quietly outside the public eye. Being born a Rockefeller is both an enormous privilege and a significant burden. You inherit wealth, but also expectations, obligations, and the complicated legacy of an ancestor who was both hero and villain. If John D. Rockefeller could see the world today, what would he think? He would recognize much of the business landscape: large corporations, global supply chains, vertical integration, strategic cost management. These are all innovations he pioneered. He would understand modern billionaires like Bezos, Gates, and Musk. Their strategies: dominate an industry, leverage technology, reinvest profits for growth, would be familiar to him. He would be amazed by the technology, but would understand the business principles underlying tech companies. Amazon's dominance of e-commerce is not so different from Standard Oil's dominance of oil refining. He would be pleased that his philanthropic model, strategic giving, focused on systemic solutions, has been adopted by modern billionaires through organizations like the Gates Foundation. But he would be surprised by some things. The strength of antitrust laws and regulation would shock him. The idea that the government could break up companies, or regulate industries extensively would seem excessive to him. Progressive taxation would horrify him. The idea that wealthy individuals should pay higher tax rates would violate his beliefs about property rights and capitalism. Labor unions and worker protections would puzzle him. He believed workers should be grateful for employment, not meet demands. Environmental regulations would seem absurd to him. The idea that businesses should be responsible for environmental damage would be foreign to his worldview. Corporate social responsibility, the modern expectation that corporations should consider stakeholders beyond shareholders, would conflict with his belief that businesses exist solely to make profits for owners. In other words, Rockefeller would recognize the business world, but would be shocked by the regulatory and social constraints modern capitalism operates under. Those constraints exist largely because of the excesses of people like him. The reforms of the Progressive Era and New Deal were direct responses to robber baron capitalism. Rockefeller helped create both the modern corporate economy and the regulatory state designed to control it. The Standard Oil breakup created some of the most valuable companies in history. Exxon became the largest publicly traded company by market capitalization for decades. At its peak in the 2000s, before the rise of tech companies, Exxon was worth over $500 billion. Chevron became another oil giant, one of the world's largest companies by revenue. Mobil eventually merged with Exxon in 1999 to form Exxon Mobil, reuniting two pieces of the original Standard Oil empire. BP, British Petroleum, acquired Standard Oil of Ohio. ConocoPhillips absorbed several other Standard Oil fragments. If you combined all the descendant companies of Standard Oil, their total value would be over $1 trillion. And all of it traces back to John D. Rockefeller's small refinery in Cleveland in 1863. It's one of the most successful business ventures in human history, creating value that has compounded for over 150 years. Even broken apart, even transformed by technology and globalization, Rockefeller's creation endures. So what is the final verdict on John D. Rockefeller? There is no simple answer. He was too complex, too contradictory, and his legacy too mixed for easy judgment. He was a business genius who created the modern oil industry and pioneered corporate strategies still used today. He was a ruthless monopolist who crushed competitors and corrupted democratic institutions. He was a generous philanthropist who gave away $500 million and created institutions that have saved millions of lives. He was a cold, calculating man who put profit above people and believed the ends justified the means. He embodied the contradictions of American capitalism: tremendous productive power combined with moral compromises, individual achievement built on collective exploitation, wealth creation that generated both progress and inequality. Rockefeller cannot be simply condemned or celebrated. He must be understood in all his complexity. He showed what was possible when one brilliant individual focused entirely on accumulating wealth and power. He built an empire. But he also showed why unlimited capitalism is dangerous. His monopoly threatened competition, democracy, and social stability. The story of the Rockefeller Empire is ultimately the story of America itself, its ambitions, its achievements, its contradictions, and its ongoing struggle to balance freedom and fairness, opportunity and equality, individual success, and social responsibility. John D. Rockefeller died in his sleep on May 23, 1937, at age 97. He had lived through the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, World War I, the Roaring Twenties, and the beginning of the Great Depression. He had started life in poverty and died the richest man in history. He had built the largest corporation the world had ever seen and watched the government break it apart. He had been America's most hated man and lived to see his reputation partially rehabilitated. He had given away $500 million and created philanthropic institutions that would save millions of lives. He left behind a family that would dominate American life for generations, and he left behind an oil industry that continues to shape the world today, for better and worse. When news of his death reached the world, reactions were mixed. Business leaders praised his genius, reformers acknowledged his philanthropy, but condemned his monopolistic practices. Ordinary Americans had complicated feelings about a man who represented both the promise and the problems of American capitalism. The New York Times obituary called him the greatest moneymaker of all time, but also noted the harsh criticism of his business methods. It was a fitting summary. Rockefeller was the greatest and the most controversial. He was buried in Cleveland, not far from where he had started his first refinery 74 years earlier. His grave is marked by a simple obelisk, no enormous monument, no ostentatious display. Even in death, Rockefeller maintained the outward appearance of modesty, even though his wealth and influence were anything but modest. Today, over 80 years after his death, John D. Rockefeller's influence is everywhere. You see it when you fill your car with gasoline from an Exxon or Chevron station. You see it in the global oil industry that powers modern civilization. You see it in the business practices taught in every business school: vertical integration, cost management, strategic planning. You see it in the major philanthropic foundations that follow the model Rockefeller pioneered. You see it in the debates about wealth inequality, corporate power, and the regulation of business. You see it in the Rockefeller family members who continue to play roles in business, politics, and philanthropy. The Rockefeller Empire, in its original form, lasted only about 40 years, from Standard Oil's founding in 1870 to its breakup in 1911. But its influence has lasted far longer. The institutions, business practices, and social tensions that Rockefeller created continue to shape the modern world. He was a man of his time who created structures that transcended his time. He was the son of a con man who became the richest person in history. He was a Sunday school teacher who built a ruthless monopoly. He was a philanthropist who gave away hundreds of millions while crushing competitors without mercy. He was John D. Rockefeller, builder of empires, creator of wealth, symbol of American capitalism in all its glory and all its contradictions. The Rockefeller Empire, from a small refinery in Cleveland to global dominance, from one man's vision to a dynasty that shaped a nation, oil, power, wealth, legacy. This has been Bloodline Chronicles,